So I think you'll see some overlaps and intersections between the last paper and mine, which I think is probably why it was organized that way, which is a good thing. But today I'm going to explore aesthetic experience of spatial and temporal infinity in both the environment and the arts. I'm interested in how infinity plays out in limitlessness and boundlessness as they are expressed through the more concrete aesthetic category of the sublime. Vast spaces, excuse me, vast spaces draw aesthetic attention outward in the spatial sublime. The temporal sublime engages us with geological phenomena and the cosmological experience of the vast starry sky at night. Artists have engaged with spatial and temporal limitlessness in important land artworks by Nancy Holt, Robert Smithson, and others. Limitlessness and boundlessness throw up significant ethical questions too. As with the sublime, ideas of infinity connect to notions of human freedom. But with that freedom, there are also limits to be drawn. Infinity carries with it, necessarily, issues concerning human infinity. And as such, raises questions about the limits of humanity in various respects. As I shall argue, such ethical questions can be usefully examined through notions of both epistemic and also moral humility. These remarks by A.W. Moore indicate how thinking about infinity brings us to existential questions about ourselves. I want to show that such existential questions must take on board not only the human, but also the more than human. In a broad sense, my aim today is going to be to sketch out something like a non-anthropocentric understanding of aesthetics and infinity. The noun sublime originates in the Greek noun hypsos, or height, while its Latin meaning is sublimis, or elevated, uplifted, aloft. Its etymology stems from, probably, sub, up to, and limen, lintel. By contrast, the infinite's roots lie in the Greek term to, I'm no Greek scholar, aperon, or no paras, being unlimited or unbounded. In both cases, well, in Latin, infinitas, boundless, endlessness. In both cases, notice the emphasis on up and out. The sublime and the infinite do not involve a turning inwards, say, to the limits of the human body, or anything else that might set limits or bounds. The sublime also involves down. Consider looking down from a mountain or a skyscraper. My point is that there is nothing appearing to block movement outwards from the body. The sublime and the infinite draw attention outwards, away, in the spatial sublime. In the spatial sublime, the qualities in the world which function to draw attention outwards and beyond include the great heights of mountains, the vast starry sky at night, vast oceans drawing the eye to the horizon, vast deserts, snow and ice fields, and so on. Here the senses are drawn to the edges of the world, toward horizons way beyond the close-up or the intimate. In her land artwork, Sun Tunnels, Nancy Holt said that, "I wanted to bring the vast space of the desert back down to human scale. I had no desire to make a megalithic monument. The panoramic view of the landscape is too overwhelming to take in without visual reference points." Sun Tunnels draws the eye into a point in the vast landscape, and through the concrete tunnel sends the eye beyond into the open desert and beyond to the sun, and with the help of imagination, beyond to the universe. The temporal sublime, not just the spatial sublime, is actually illustrated here as well. The four large concrete cylinders of Sun Tunnels align with the sunrise and sunset on the summer and winter solstices. Each of the cylinders is pierced with smaller holes representing the stars of 4 constellations. I'll leave it with Nancy Holt for the moment and see whether she moves into Addison or not, or moves back rather. The early 18th century critic, Joseph Addison, ties the sublime to an activity of imagination, where it is filled or pushed beyond what it can take in. Imagination is expanded through attempting to present an image of the object to the mind. The vast size of an ocean reaching into the horizon vitalizes and extends imagination. Freedom and expansion characterize imagination in response to greatness in objects that are themselves unbounded and expansive. Imagination, Addison says, Imagination, Addison says, dislikes being constrained, so that the pleasure of the sublime is related to a feeling of freedom. Addison's remarks anticipate the free play found in Kant's aesthetic theory, and also relate to Addison's conception of the mathematical sublime. Here we go. Such wide and undetermined prospects are as pleasing to the fancy as the speculations of eternity or infinitude are to the understanding. Addison thinks that we also reflect on an image of our own freedom as instantiated in experiences of the sublime in nature, where he says, a spacious horizon is an image of liberty, where the eye has room to range abroad, to expatiate at large on the immensity of its views. This is suggestive of a similar link made between the sublime and morality in Kant's theory, where sublimity opens out to an awareness of human freedom. What is it about time specifically, and not just the physical immensity of, say, the heavens, that is sublime? It appears that we are talking about an idea, which is somehow expressed or substantiated through perceptible or material qualities, with imagination enlarged by what we experience through the senses. As something beyond our ken, we might usefully grasp the sublimity of time through the concept of the mathematical sublime. For Kant and others, the mathematical sublime designates a type of aesthetic judgment in which the senses and imagination are incapable of apprehending some object due to its vast, seemingly infinite size. The temporal sublime presents a mode of the mathematical sublime that is related to quantity, not through infinite number or infinite space, height or depth, but rather through points in time, and in cases of deep time, a notion from geology, by stretching successively these points of time backwards. There are precedents in theories of the sublime for understanding ideas in this way. Mathematical theorems and astronomical ideas involving large numbers or great abstractions serve as historical examples of non-extended sublime objects, mainly in discussions in the 18th century. In Kant's pre-critical work on the sublime, he mentions examples of, quote, the mathematical representation of the immeasurable magnitude of the universe and metaphysical considerations of eternity. Perhaps this is a response to aesthetic qualities of vastness captured through temporal scale, and which form part of the idea's context. So when we find something sublime but based on age or history, it seems that it is a combination of an idea of the sublime and perceptible qualities in the world coming together. David Hume articulates the temporal sublime in this way. The mind, elevated by the vastness of its object, is still farther elevated by the difficulty of the conception, and being obliged every moment to renew its efforts in the transition from one part of time to another, feels a more vigorous and sublime disposition than in a transition through the parts of space. The imagination gives us a proportionable veneration for it. The temporal sublime is both backward and forward-looking, referring to ancient history but also to eternity, and thus capturing phenomena stretching far into the future. While Hume focused on the example of antiquity to convey his notion, it can easily be applied to landscapes. Indeed, also during the Scottish Enlightenment, John Playfair said of James Hutton's concept of deep time, a notion of geologic time measuring the age of the earth, that, quote, "the mind seemed to grow giddy by looking so far into the abyss of time." And my image here is Hutton's unconformity. There were different examples in the geology in Scotland and beyond that Hutton used to understand and theorize deep time. And this is one place not too far from where I live. A temporal sublime which looks to the earth rather than sky and space is familiar in Robert Smithson's work. His fascination with the unscenic, the ruined, and the post-industrial also pays tribute to the relentless, inevitable power and forces of nature, especially entropy and geological change. His most famous work, Spiral Jetty, spirals 1,500 feet into the Great Salt Lake. The work is dynamic rather than static. Depending on the water level of the lake, it submerges and reemerges, now covered with white salt crystals. The artwork operates on various levels, from the sheer physicality of the spiral to its expansive lake site with long stretches of water and land, to ideas about earth, creation, and mathematics. Smithson described the site of Spiral Jetty in evocative terms. As I looked at the site, it reverberated out to the horizons, only to suggest an immobile cyclone, while flickering light made the entire landscape appear to quake. A dormant earthquake spread into the fluttering stillness, into a spinning sensation without movement. The site was a rotary that enclosed itself in an immense roundness. From that gyrating space emerged the possibility of Spiral Jetty. No ideas, no concepts, no systems, no structures, no abstractions could hold themselves together in the actuality of that evidence. The description is striking for the way it captures infinity in a designed landscape, in an artwork, and the uncertainty and energy of geological forces at work. Spiral Jetty speaks across the temporal divide of short-term and long-term thinking, as well as the human nature divide. The work urges humans to reconnect deep time through the land. Discussions about the historical sublime and interpretations of Kant's theory of the sublime tend to center on ways in which sublime aesthetic experience opens out a feeling of human freedom and even power in the face of mighty forces in nature and beyond. My own reading of Kant has tried to emphasize the ways in which humans are made to feel insignificant in relation to power and greatness in nature, thereby opening out a valuing of nature, excuse me, as well as valuing of humans, or more specifically, human freedom. I'm interested in finding how humanity can find a place in relation to the natural world through sublime aesthetic experience. My interpretation of Kant attempts to address criticisms of the sublime from various quarters and to decentralize the human. So while the sublime and infinity do raise existential questions, in pondering these questions, I would urge us to consider forms of interconnectedness to the more than human world. Our metaphysical ponderings in relation to the sublime and infinity ought to extend beyond the human condition. Let me explore this a bit further. In a forest of sequoia trees, we find complex ecosystems involving various forms of interactions, as well as growth, decay, the effects of weather, the seasons, and so on. An aesthetic engagement involves attention to a range of qualities and recognition of the temporal aspects of life on and beyond Earth, the evolution of species, individual lifespans, ecologies, and geologies in the universe. This sort of engagement can be framed in terms of what I call intergenerational aesthetics. It incorporates a temporal cosmology, where aesthetic phenomena are understood with reference to pasts and futures. Intergenerational aesthetics takes time seriously, foregrounding the temporal dynamic character of aesthetic qualities, concepts, and phenomena. It makes explicit the ways in which humans are diachronically intertwined with ecological, geological, and sentient others and processes. In this way, it also encourages long-term thinking, requiring the moral agent to perceive and imagine beyond present lives. Environmental thinkers recognize such time depth as significant in aesthetic and other values. It is expressed, for example, by the conservationist Albert Leopold in his Marshland Elegy, which is a lament about the loss of a marsh in the face of agricultural development. A sense of time lies thick and heavy on such a place. Yearly since the Ice Age, it has wakened each spring to the clangor of cranes. The peat layers that comprise the bog are laid down in the basin of an ancient lake. The cranes stand, as it were, upon the soft pages of their own history. These peats are the compressed remains of the mosses that clog the pools, of the tamaracks that spread over the moss of the ice sheet. An endless caravan of generations has built of its own bones this bridge into the future, this habitat where the oncoming host again may live and breed and die. These reflections speak to the limits of humankind and the richness and diversity of deep time expressed through an ecocentric rather than anthropocentric lens. He reminds us of the true limits of the human with respect to other kinds of life on Earth. Hume and Hutton, back in history again, could be seen as precursors to recent forays into geoaesthetics and various critical discussions about the Anthropocene within the emerging area of the environment of humanities. Stratigraphers have declared the new geological age of the Anthropocene as one in which humans have had pervasive effects on the Earth. But pushing against this is the more than human, the beyond of natural phenomena. The landscapes of Iceland today provide an interesting example of just how insignificant the human remains. Encountering the great volcanic landscapes of Askja in the highlands, Paul Skulason points to the independence of nature and a temporal sublime, showing how overwhelming places can determine the limits of human in relation to environment. You can read that. It is a unique natural system within which mountains, lakes, and sky converge in a volcanic crater. Askja, in short, symbolizes the Earth itself. It is the Earth as it was, is, and will be, for as long as this planet continues to orbit space. Whatever we do and whether or not we are here on this Earth, Askja was formed, the Earth was formed, long before we were created, and Askja will be here long after we are gone. Okay, moving now to thinking about ethics a little bit more centrally. Humility originates in the Latin humilis, which means low. The concept of humility in everyday language and in the theoretical history of the concept has a moral and religious flavor. The feeling of humility contrasts with feelings of pride, for example, in suggesting a willingness to serve or bow to others. Humility is a way of relating to the more than human world, both epistemically and morally, characterized by awareness of the limits of human power and knowledge. In its moral sense, humility has been written about by many disciplines and celebrated, for example, by Christian ethics in the life of St. Francis. Although there are many different definitions of humility, I propose that it at least means the recognition of human limits and the actions which flow from that recognition. For example, recognizing and tolerating others' beliefs can constitute a form of respect, and an understanding that my own beliefs are not the only ones that matter. In environmental ethics, Simon James discusses humility. He was influenced quite strongly, he is influenced quite strongly, Simon James, by Buddhism. And he's interested in how humility is incompatible with self-aggrandizement. he points out the sort of temporal dimension of humility here. He says the humble person will not tend to exaggerate the significance of his or her projects on natural historical timescales, if he or she will tend to be humbled by evolutionary or geological considerations. Considering the fate of a particular endangered species, he or she will be acutely aware of the vast evolutionary history that produced it, the accumulated effects of countless tiny changes in the genetic composition of the relevant populations. And he or she will therefore realize how momentous an event it would be if we laid commerce to the evolutionary scene, for it to bring about its extinction by, say, flooding the valley in which its last remaining population was located. Humility and aesthetics can be brought together in an aesthetic ethical relationship with the world through the sublime. Here, the emphasis on nature's infinitude or power makes the human feel small and insignificant. The feeling of insignificance in the literature on the sublime is commonly linked to being humiliated, but also, I think, to a feeling of humility. Natural phenomena have the potential to humble the self and potentially open out an awareness that there are other things in the world or universe that are greater than humanity. The sublime is offered here to present a case of experiences which force receptivity to things other than ourselves, a kind of forcing of humility. For example, Schopenhauer describes the sublime in these terms. If we lose ourselves in contemplation of the infinite greatness of the universe in space and time, mediate on the past millennia and on those to come, or if the heavens at night actually bring innumerable worlds before our eyes, and so impress on our consciousness the immensity of the universe, we feel ourselves reduced to nothing. Receptivity, being open to the world in its diversity, is a feature of both humility and compassion. The quote from Schopenhauer illustrates a kind of receptivity which seems to move between the aesthetic, metaphysical, and epistemological. Epistemic humility can be understood as a form of epistemic finitude, that is, recognizing the limits of the human perspective, of human knowledge in particular. Kant's critical philosophy is famous for its treatment of epistemic finitude. But more generally, and with respect to the concept of wisdom, we can understand epistemic finitude in a sort of broader, wider, and perhaps more comprehensible sense than maybe Kant sometimes puts it. And I just use Sharon Ryan's way of putting it. She says, wise people, one might argue, possess epistemic self-confidence, yet lack epistemic arrogance. Wise people tend to acknowledge their fallibility, and wise people are reflective, introspective, and tolerant of uncertainty. Any acceptable theory of wisdom ought to be compatible with such traits. When thinking about epistemic humility, a key ingredient of the former, meaning humility, is recognizing the possibility that human knowledge is fallible. It is to be tolerant of uncertainty, and in that way contrasts with epistemic arrogance. Epistemic humility not only indicates the limits of knowledge, but it can also serve as a guide to action, to how we might conduct ourselves in terms of trying to understand and be receptive to the world. Socrates is for some, a model of how epistemic humility becomes a sort of virtue. Some criticisms of Christian humility argue that it is a stance which is overly humble, bowing to others, lacking strength, even pathetic. If we're overly receptive, do we become passive, even afraid to act? Do we begin to question knowledge too readily? Regardless of which kind of humility we're talking about, I think it's important to develop confidence in our knowledge and interactions, and to recognize that disempowered humans, and disempowered more than human others, require being effective and powerful as needed to overcoming injustices. I would want to also avoid advocating the position of being overly sensitive to the question of what it is that we do and do not know, or a skepticism skepticism driven by the quest for epistemic humility and respecting other forms of life. Such skepticism could endanger human relations with the more than human world, and with other humans, of course, leaving little room for the relevance of different kinds of knowledges, for critical anthropomorphism as well, which at least brings us into range with other beings. Climate deniers, interestingly, present an excellent example of the dangers of questioning knowledge too readily in order to justify, in their case, the continuance of human activities which are damaging to Earth. The stance of epistemic humility seeks a balance between what we can and cannot know, operating as a good insofar as it limits hubris. Okay. To conclude, I've talked about infinity and sublimity. I've talked about how they stretch the senses and imagination through aesthetic experiences of space, time, and freedom. Importantly, too, I've suggested ways to grasp not only limitlessness and boundlessness, but also limits and bounds. Such limits can be set by decentering the human and recognizing the significance of humility, where humility presents a way of drawing the lines of human finitude. In thinking through infinity, I have pointed up the significance of ethics. And so I'd like to leave you with a quote and an artwork, remarks by Nancy Snow on humility. To think too much of yourself and too little of values extending beyond the self is to lack proper humility. And this is a photograph, which is a photograph of a performance by the artist Ilana Halperin, who's boiling milk in